The United States came out with the Wolfowitz Doctrine, or formerly known as the Bush Doctrine. It was the defense strategy for the U.S. between 1994 and 1999. It was written in 1992, though. It was a classified document, but it was leaked to the New York Times. And the ultimate goal of that document was to reevaluate the U.S. military strategy around the world. We just spent 70 years spending countless dollars building countless weapons and technology to try and win the Cold War and protect us from a possible Soviet threat. The Soviet threat was gone. The United States was now the sole superpower of the world. China isn't even in the picture yet. And the Wolfowitz Doctrine basically says that we will remain the sole superpower and we will never let another country challenge us. In these non-democratic countries, you're a threat and we're going to take care of you. And we're going to squash international threats before it happens because we left this job up to the Englands and the Frances back in World War I and World War II, and both times they failed. And it ended up costing not just millions of lives in Europe, but hundreds of thousands of American lives for a war that they didn't even start. Another portion, going back to World War I and World War II, is both times the United States drew down its forces following the wars and kind of shifted focus away from the military. And both times they were caught standing flat-footed and unprepared. You had Pearl Harbor, and then they even go as far as using the Korean War as an example, when quoted in there, the United States was almost pushed off of the entire peninsula into the water by a third-rate power. And they will never let that happen again. Hindsight, we see that it did, but that was the writing of this doctrine. Now, another important aspect of this is that we are going to build a democratic defense community, NATO, and we're going to expand it. And we're actually going to focus on getting Ukraine and a democratic Russia into this community. We want them in this community. But they need to be democratic. They need to follow our rules. We're also going to build up our forces so strong that the United States will be able to take care of itself. We're going to grow partnerships, and we're going to utilize our allies. And in some cases, we're going to make it seem like these other organizations, like a regional organization, or maybe the UN is in control and they're taking the lead and we're just helping out. We're going to give it that appearance, but in reality, it's the United States that controls it. And if our allies don't want to get on board, then we don't need them. We'll do it ourselves. And as we see, they've done a good job at building our military up to do that. And they said, you know, we're going to remain the biggest and baddest force to ever walk this earth right now and for the foreseeable future. That was the objective of that defense strategy. But it focused on protecting American interest, be it defense interests, strategic, economic interest, whatever, all around the world. So when you ask, well, why are we getting into these little conflicts everywhere, it all derives from that doctrine. Russia had to sit back and reevaluate its own military strategy as well. And I'm going to read what that involves. So in the Balkan conflict, Russia ended up getting involved, which immediately barred them from receiving any assistance under the Freedom Support Act. And Russia said, hey, allow us to use our peacekeepers and send peacekeepers into this region because we've been keeping peace here for the last couple hundred years. And we know the cultures, and allow us, just pay us to do it. Sounds like a good deal, but the United States was skeptical about their intentions and said that given Russia's history, they actually tend to go in and incite more violence than they do squashing the violence. So they said no. Now, some of Russia's objectives, and this is from their documentation, it says Russia's current objectives, which closely parallel its historic geostrategic objectives, include guaranteeing its access to warm water ports in the Black Sea and Baltic Seas. By the way, the only warm water port going into the Black Sea is the Dnieper River that splits Ukraine. Maintaining a buffer zone between Russia and its traditional rivals Turkey, Iran, and China. You have Kazakhstan as kind of a buffer between China, even though they do have a border with China. And you have Georgia, the Chechnya area would border it, or would keep that buffer between them and Turkey, and plus the Black Sea. And then Iran, you have all the other Middle Eastern countries that they're over. And the European powers to the west. So they had Belarus, they had the Baltic states still at that time, and then they have Ukraine. Preserving the Russian hegemony in the region and preventing other regional powers from emerging. Retaining control over raw materials in the former republics, including oil, gas, and minerals, which there was dispute between in Ukraine about this. Ensuring access to industrial facilities in former republics. Retaining control over the defense industrial complex in the former republics, and including nuclear power plants and nuclear hardware, and guaranteeing markets for its products. It also enumerates the following as being sources for external threat which Russia will act on militarily: a territorial claim on Russia and its allies, current and potential hotbeds of local wars and armed conflicts in the vicinity of Russian borders, possible utilization of nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction, the suppression of rights, freedoms, and legitimate interests of Russian-speaking citizens in foreign states, and attacks on Russian armed forces and military facilities in foreign countries. This was written in the 90s. This whole Ukraine conflict contains violations of all of those. All of them, literally. Ukraine has a civil war going on right at Russia's border. They don't want the expansion of NATO. They don't want the suppression of rights and freedoms and legitimate interests of Russian-speaking citizens in foreign states. In Ukraine, they tried to actually suppress the Russians and the Russian-speaking people. The first part of those about their interest: warm water ports, maintaining a buffer zone, which they were losing, and combating the rise of international powers in that region, which is NATO. All Russia's doing right now is abiding by their own defense strategy, which, by the way, the United States would do the exact same thing. But how did we get here? So right here it says that the United States government does not want to be perceived as guilty of having lost Russia, but does it want to be responsible for the loss of 14 newly independent states. They need to weigh the two. Although no one in the administration has suggested publicly that these states are expendable, the U.S. is acquiescing in the de facto reconstitution of the USSR by turning its head as Russia maneuvers its way back into the affairs of all its former republics. The details in this report suggest that while Yeltsin is still in power, and while the U.S. retains a degree of influence with Russian government, the United States should give serious consideration to alternative policies, as, for example, be tough on the issue of the Baltic states and demand that Russia quickly comply with its agreement to withdraw troops from Estonia and Latvia. Oppose attempts by Russia to install Russian peacekeepers unilaterally in the former Soviet republics. Do not simply farm off responsibility to allied regional powers such as Turkey. Make symbolic moves in the region to demonstrate that the entire U.S. policy is not Moscow-centric, such as initiating high-level meetings with heads of state that are not simply an adjunct to meetings in Moscow, inviting heads of state to Washington, D.C., offering high-profile technical assistance to individual states for the development of key infrastructure, creating prestigious fellowship programs for each individual state, rather than for the former Soviet republics as a bloc. So they wanted to identify each one of these countries as their own country, and they wanted Russia to abide by the principles that they laid out in the Freedom Support Act. Otherwise, they were actually going to favor taking the side of the newly independently formed countries instead of Russia. That was the U.S. thinking when it came to this. Now, Yeltsin becomes a drunk, or he may have already been a drunk, but he becomes really bad. He's an alcoholic. In 1998, towards the end of his reign, I think the United States is actually seeing Yeltsin kind of, he's on his way out. So what does NATO do? NATO goes and breaks their promise that was made to Gorbachev, and they expand. and taken 3 countries. Yeltsin questions this move and says, hey, you guys made a promise you weren't going to expand. The United States says, no, we promised the Soviet Union that we wouldn't expand NATO. We didn't promise Russia. And even if we did, that agreement wasn't even formal. It wasn't even written down. That didn't go down well. Now Putin comes into office in 2000.